Today on Pilot's Discretion, we're talking about aviation trends with longtime analyst Richard Aboulafia. He shares his opinion on supersonic business jets, electric airplanes, and what's going on with the airlines. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hello, pilots. I'm John Zimmerman of Sporties, and welcome to Pilot's Discretion. Today, I'm excited to have Richard Aboulafia on the show. He is simultaneously one of the most respected and most incisive aviation analysts around. And I've enjoyed reading his work for many years because he's not afraid to be brutally honest when needed, which I think you'll hear today. He worked at Jane's Information Group and then edited the Teal Group's World Military and Civil Aircraft Briefing for many years. Today, he is a managing director at Aerodynamic Advisory and has written for many outlets, including Aviation Week, Forbes, and Professional Pilot. Richard, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
It's great to be here, John. Thanks for having me on.
I'd like to get your thoughts on the boom in business aviation right now. This is a story that has been reported, but I feel like most people, even pilots, don't really understand just how busy some of these companies like NetJets or Wheels Up are right now. What's driving the biz jet boom right now, and where do you think we are in that cycle?
Yeah, it's sort of taken a life beyond just a mere cycle. It's pretty impressive. First of all, the Part 91K, Part 135, charter and fractional and all that other stuff is way above where it was back in 2019 pre-pandemic. Flight departments are, I believe, just above that too in terms of activity or getting there. Um, it's just very impressive. Obviously, it was driven by a combination of of concerns about crowded airport terminals, along with service cutbacks in the scheduled airlines, as well as a high level of wealth creation at the top. The past couple of years have been surprisingly good for the stock market and whatever else, corporate profits, whatever else. Um, the big question as the pandemic ends, as service is restored to the nation's network airlines and whatever else, do the people who've joined BizAv stay? And some of them are just going to go back to business as usual, but it's pretty clear that at least a percentage, maybe 15, maybe 20, of the newcomers are going to stick around. And that's fantastic. It lifts the industry to a new higher level.
How far do you think that has trickled down? Has it made it down into the world of the lighter end of general aviation, or is the boom there mostly just flight training driven by the airline market?
It seems pretty broad. You look at demand for, say, turboprops or whatever else, it's above where it was. So it seems like it's pretty broad. Now, training requirements are up. Shared fleets, fractionals, charters using smaller aircraft, turboprops, and whatever else. That's nicely up too. This appears to be a fairly democratic uptick, if you want to call it that. It's not just the usual, the phenomenon we've seen in the business for the past decade or so has been wonderful fortunes for $80 million jets, Gulfstream 650s, Globals, whatever else. But you looked at your Cessnas, you looked at your, Embraers, whatever, not so much. This appears to be far more widely spread. And that's certainly welcome news.
You mentioned the $80 million Gulfstreams. There's been a lot of headlines for a lot of years about supersonic business jets. They seem to be 5 years away and perpetually so. But recently there's been news on both sides. Aviation closed up shop, but Boom is still making a lot of noise. Do you think we'll ever see a supersonic business jet?
It's funny. I first worked on that something like, oh boy, got to be 25 years ago. And it seemed like a decent idea, with one big caveat, which is that there are, of course, enormous trades in designing a supersonic business jet. It's not like a free lunch. Oh, wow, it just goes faster. We throw money at it. You have to compromise an awful lot, most obviously in cabin and in range. You can't do trans-Pacific very easily, if at all. Cabin, you get a much smaller cabin. Basically, Aviation was a very honest proposal. Like everything they did was, yep, this is the way it's going to be. You're going to spend $120 million on something that looks like a supercharged Learjet cabin. Okay, so it's a $35 million jet hiding in a $120 million jet. Okay, that is really what supersonics look like. Yeah, now, what percentage of the ultra high end, yes, I can afford $120 million market is willing to say, I don't care about the cabin. I don't care about flying to Tokyo. I just want to go supersonic. There's got to be somebody. Our feeling was, looking at it over the years, that there is, a market in the hundreds, couple hundred, maybe three, 400, something like that. Will somebody be able to, throw in the 3, 4, 5 billion in non-recurring money, development money needed to make the bespoke product that meets that demand? Boy, with Ariane dead, I'm not so sure who would. Boom is really going after commercial passengers. They've designed an $80 million, sorry, not $80 million, 80 seat jet, which will sell for hundreds of millions of dollars. I find the whole thing bizarre, to be honest. And what they produced at Farnborough, we were at Farnborough when they unveiled the new aircraft. It looked a lot like a B-58 Hustler nuclear bomber back from 1960. I was just baffled. Like, why not stick four J-79 engines under it and call it a day? Um, so I don't understand it at all. So the answer is, the plane I did understand is dead. The plane I don't understand, still going.
How much of that is dependent on regulatory reform where I could really fly supersonic New York to LA instead of just to London?
Well, it's a combination of regulatory change and technology progress. Some interesting research in shaping booms, or, you know, just modifying engines or whatever else, basically ameliorating the impact of hitting supersonic speed. And there's some interesting progress there. The answer is that, the truth is somewhere in the middle. There can be changes made at the regulatory level and technological progress. I don't think that's the showstopper. The showstopper is economics, both the cost of creating this stuff and, of course, finding people who are willing to pay that premium. But it's not going to be the boom or the, you know regulations against the boom itself.
We can't talk about hype and new airplanes without mentioning eVTOL aircraft and air mobility plans. There's been all kinds of news over the last 5, 6 years about this. Companies like Joby and Archer, but I think sometimes overlooked is the big players here. Boeing invested in Wisk. Embraer has made some moves. You seem skeptical, as many people are. You wrote recently, quote, advanced air mobility looks like a very messy $10 billion bubble. Why is that?
Yeah, I like to correct myself. It now looks like a very messy $20 billion bubble. I mean, whatever number you like, right? I mean, these look like helicopters. And yes, there's all kinds of technological progress in them, obviously the electric motor. But in terms of, again, getting back to me being a hammer in search of a nail, you know, economics. How often are you or I given exclusive access to the use of a $4 million tool of any kind? Doesn't happen to me too often, sadly. I think I I was once alone in an extremely expensive elevator in a skyscraper. Other than that, it just doesn't happen. Um, like Uber for dot dot dot. The last time I took an Uber, I think its economic value was about 10,000, not 4 million. So the idea that there's going to be this mass market where capital costs just go away. Someone else pays for those $4 million air vehicles, to say nothing of the well-trained helicopter pilot who's in charge of this thing. Um, it's just bizarre to me. Now, is there a market for some kind of eVTOL taking over, or perhaps even stimulating part of the vertical flight market? Yes. Now, that the vertical flight market, in terms of just looking at the machinery, light turbines and pistons, it's about $1 billion a year. Could it get to 2 billion? Sure. Um, there are hundreds of people who want to break into this market. The result will be carnage.
This has echoes of another episode in aviation, which you were an astute observer of 20 years ago, with the very light jet boom and air taxis and day jet and how that was going to transform the world. You wrote recently, I think we all learned from this debacle, never again will grifters and techno-utopians pull a fast one on unsuspecting rubes with too much money. And you say that tongue in cheek because obviously that seems to be what's happening here. Why do you think it keeps happening? What is it about the aviation market that these type of bubbles keep blowing up?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And I would broaden the conversation. I would say, what's the number one characteristic of the world economy now, which is probably just too much cash, just chasing too few good ideas. And you couple that with a weird Silicon Valley way of thinking about it. You and I put money down in our investments for retirement, whatever. You think, all right, I sure hope I earn 5 or whatever% per year. That'd be nice, retire, that'd be great. The Silicon Valley way of doing it is you throw, every fund out there in Silicon Valley throws 10 or 20 or 50 million at 100 or 500 different targets. If half of them die or two-thirds of them die or all of them die except for one, and that one resembles Amazon or Uber, they've done it. They've cracked the code. So in other words, you can always get these parcels of incremental funding from somebody who's going to take a chance at you. Do they do a whole lot of due diligence? No, they don't need to. They're looking for 1 out of 100 to be a unicorn. And so there's a lot of cash sloshing around that way, enabling these companies to just sort of, go on for a bit. I think Boom is probably the same model. You know, at Farnborough, they had this really big chalet. Are they an aircraft company? No. Do they have any revenue whatsoever? No. But they've got enough people to give them 10 million here, 20 million there, 40 million there, that you can make a big splash, hire a bunch of people, and maybe one day the bill will come due. But in the meantime, life is great.
And why do you think the aviation industry is sometimes nervous about calling out some of these schemes? Do we want them to work, or is it just that we feel like we don't understand these big smart technology investors? Why do a lot of people seem to get swept up into it?
Yeah, great question. Part of it, of course, is that all of us are, aviation fans, and it kind of hurts to, you know, Boom is sort of making itself a target at this point because of this latest redesign. But I want a new Concorde. I mean, that's cool, right? And I know plenty of pilots who are, it's like they'd love to fly the new Concorde. Uh, in other words, there are many people who are just simply, well, enthusiastic about the equipment, and that's great. But I'm here with my bucket of cold water as an economics type guy. It's my job. I apologize, but a lot of this just doesn't look great to me.
Now, beyond the eVTOL world, there is a lot of money being spent on new propulsion technology, whether it's electric, hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel. A lot of buzz there, but maybe there's something real there. What do you think is the most promising project there over the next, say, 25 years?
Yeah, this is of course hugely important because we don't want to see the return of flight shaming, especially for business aviation. Every so often, you'll see some story about Hollywood stars. They talk about pollution and emissions, but then they get in their Gulf Streams. We got to have some kind of defense against that, right? And the previous answer was, we apologize. We're going to be the last part of the economy that decarbonizes. Have a nice day. That's not an acceptable answer. So we're kind of grasping here. Um, it's hard to tell. I think for certain parts of the industry, like for example, small 9 to 19 seat aircraft, I think you could easily see electrification or hybrid kicking in the next 15, 20 years. That seems reasonable. Hydrogen is terribly divisive. There are people who are true believers, but I know a lot of very smart people, a lot of smart academics who say, no way, you just can't get there. Um, just because of, look, you're carrying around fluid that needs to be chilled to negative 257 degrees Celsius. The equipment to do that is going to go where your passengers and payload used to be. That's a bad idea. So I tend to be pretty skeptical of hydrogen based upon talking to people who are smarter than me on it. SAF appears to be the one big hope, especially if you, you know, try to shift things in favor of a SAF that can be dropped into existing power plants. The problem here, of course, is what's your feedstock? I mean, if you do this with conventional means, you need a land area the size of Brazil to provide the necessary SAF. It needs to be a major breakthrough. And the problem here is that that breakthrough isn't coming from the aircraft industry, it's coming from chemical engineers, biologists, whoever else, who are not in aviation. So we're kind of at the mercy of them from that standpoint. But something has to be done. I mean, again, we from a public image standpoint and whatever else, we're going to have to find a solution by 2050.
So for years, the efficiency gains of jet engines, I think, has been one of the more underrated advances in technology, where just every year the jet engines get more and more efficient. From a purely realistic economic standpoint, do you think the effort that goes into that is going to go by the wayside? Are we going to lose some of that inherent efficiency in jet engines because everybody's focused on the moonshot?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. To me, it's the biggest single question mark because this is the great unsung story of aviation. Every year since dawn of the jet age, the late 1950s, we've done about 1% or more better each year on average in emissions reductions and fuel burn. That's incredible. I don't think there's any other industry on the planet like that. Cars, no. Shipping, no. Trucks, no. We're really great at that. And I'm a little concerned right now because the you know, frankly, the aerospace industrial base seems to be deprioritizing engines, next generation engines. At Farnborough, Rolls-Royce announced that the UltraFan was effectively being shelved. That's unfortunate. Pratt and Whitney, they continue to make progress in scaling up the geared turbofan. I wish them all the best, but I'm not sure I see a short-term application. I am intrigued by GE and Safran CFM's Rise prop fan. I remember prop fans when I was a turbine analyst back in the 80s, and they weren't ready then. Maybe they will be in 15 years. That to me is perhaps the one technology that could really give us double-digit improvements in fuel burn and emissions that I think should be invested. That and continued investment into geared engines. I think there's a lot of hope, you know, but as you say, I've got a real concern, and a lot of people have a real concern that a lot of the cash is being dragged away from this practical stuff and towards some kind of, nuclear-powered hybrid electric hydrogen monster.
Richard, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with a few more questions.
Earn your pilot's license, get current, or add a rating. No matter what your goal is, Sporty's pilot training app will save you time and money. It's available on all your devices, including iPad, iPhone, Android, and smart TVs, so you can access Sporty's award-winning courses anywhere. Plus, with automatic sync between platforms and free lifetime updates, you'll always be up to date. Over 25 courses are available, from private pilot to aerobatics. Visit sportys.com/discover for a free trial. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
Richard, it's certainly been quite a summer for airline travel. The business has been booming, as you mentioned earlier, but canceled flights and lost bags seem like they've been booming as well. I know I've experienced that personally. The airlines say they need more pilots. The pilot unions say they need better working conditions. A lot of people say they need more concrete to land airplanes on. How do you think all this will shake out this moment in the airline business?
Well, it's messy, right? I mean, I don't think anybody thought that the market would come back as fast as it had. I mean, just to give it some quick historical perspective, the worst year we'd ever seen in jet era history saw a 3% decline in demand in one year. 9/11, after 9/11, that was, when you look at it on average, 2001 was a 3% drop. Gulf War One, 1973 oil shock, whatever else, it was typically a 3%. Well, in 2000, we saw a 66% drop. It's just a completely different order of magnitude. And everyone thought, it's going to take a few years. Well, it's a very fast, lumpy, I guess you could call it, comeback. And that, of course, is straining everything, especially since this is the first time in the history of the business that we are not leading the way. Historically, Aviation leads the way in terms of economic comebacks. Not now. Every other segment of the economy was going gangbusters. We were the last to hire people. A lot of people got jobs elsewhere. Um, and of course, we were the last to sign contracts for just about everything from energy to materials. Things are in short supply. This is hard. This is hard. And I don't wish ill on the rest of the economy, far from it. But if things do soften up a little bit, that would free up resources for aviation. That would perhaps be good. Again, not to wish ill on the economy. But right now, the broader economy is still doing pretty well, as evidenced by the very, very strong hiring numbers for July that just came out, 528,000, I think. So I'm a little concerned. I'm concerned that we're going to continue to see bottlenecks, inflation, whatever else. And it's probably going to persist through the rest of the year, the way things are going.
They say that necessity is the mother of invention. Do you think, born out of this, there will be some lasting changes to the airlines, or do you think the cycle will just eventually turn and we'll mostly get back to the way things were?
Well, the other great economics prediction that if things revert to the mean, right? I mean, I'd love to see some improvement. One thing I would really like to see is just a completely different way of looking at labor management relations. Obviously, aviation has always been, sort of depending upon your perspective, overly aggressive management or overly militant unions, depending upon your perspective. I'd like to say that people will say, hey, this is crazy. You have the upper hand. We have the upper hand, depending upon the time of day. Why don't we just try to get along here and come up with terms that make both of us happy and work together? They do it in Germany. Why can't we do it here? But again, it's hard to be optimistic about these sorts of things.
Any conversation about airlines, you have to bring up Boeing, at least in America. And you've been very critical of Boeing management in recent years. One comment you made a while back, I think, sums it up really well. You said, quote, aviation is not like other industries. What do you mean by that, and why is that?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. From my standpoint, it is pretty clear that you've got to take care of your core in terms of design capabilities. Engineering design teams in aviation, they got their start in World War II, and we've just kept going. Barriers to entry are extremely high. And despite, efforts to make things more, roboticized with CAD CAM and whatever else, it's still heavily dependent upon the human element. So the idea of saying, well, all right, we don't, we can spread design teams everywhere from Uzbekistan to Brazil, and not have to worry about maintaining a core product design capability, or we can slash new product development spending for a couple of decades and then hire new people when it's time to launch a new jet. It doesn't work like that. You've got to carefully cultivate and protect your product design teams. And some companies do a pretty good job of that. Boeing in recent years has not. They've lost a lot of talent. And I think they've really lost their focus on what makes them unique, that ability to create new products that the market wants in a timely and effective way. This began perhaps with the Dreamliner, great product, but they said, oh, we'll just get other people to design a lot of it for us. And they've continued this philosophy on the military side, teaming with other people to do a lot of the design work, rather than saying, we've got amazing designers, we need to keep those teams going. And that I think is basically the gist of it.
We won't get into all the gory details of the 737 MAX, but I'm interested in what you think the right lessons are to learn from this. Have we overreacted in some ways and underreacted in others?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we focused on, the regulatory aspect is important, making sure that there's oversight and whatever else. But I think the bigger lesson is how Boeing was structured at the time that MAX happened. I mean, I'm not blaming individuals, but it seemed that you couldn't have asked for a better recipe for engineer disempowerment than the way things were structured at Boeing when the MAX was being developed. You had the head of the company, a non-engineer, who frankly had delusions of being an engineer. It was kind of weird. And that would be fine as long as the commercial unit was headed by an engineer, and it was not. So for the first time ever, you had the head of the company, not an engineer, the head of the business unit, not an engineer, and then a company culture, frankly, that had been shifted heavily in favor of money, making it very clear to people that, yes, they could complain about things like, say, timelines or resources, but it probably wouldn't be great for their career. It was a complete recipe for engineering disempowerment that I think helped contribute, not necessarily, there are obviously many, many causes behind the tragedies, but one thing I think contributed was this deprioritization of engineering in the company culture. And I think that's the big lesson that has been somewhat overlooked and needs to be paid attention to.
All right, Richard, we always close these episodes with a segment we call Ready to Copy. So I'll ask some questions on a variety of topics, and you give me your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Sounds fantastic. Let's go.
You mentioned the Concorde earlier. Was that a success or a failure?
Technically it was a space age miracle, but of course, commercially, they sold, quote unquote, 14. How could that be a success, especially when the 14 were sold to government owned airlines that, paid for them using taxpayer dollars? You can't ask for a better disparity between engineering success and commercial failure. But what a plane.
Here's one I'm pretty sure I know where you stand on. You called the Airbus A380, quote, a wretched jet born of misplaced nationalism, wishful thinking, and sheer hubris, the worst product launch decision since New Coke. And as somebody who grew up in Atlanta, I can tell you that is a stinging rebuke. Why do you say that? What was so bad about the A380?
Oh, boy. Everything, from a commercial standpoint, the idea that everyone will always want to change planes in Frankfurt or Narita forever was a complete impoverishment of thinking. The idea that you wouldn't have diminishing returns or route when it comes to size of jets, or route fragmentation for geographic or chronological or brand reasons or whatever else. And then on top of that, they decided to cater to one customer, Singapore, that resulted in dumb, stubby wings and way too much weight. And they thought maybe, too, that they should basically design a 650-seat jet that would one day be stretched into 650 seats, but was really just 550 seats with a lot of excess structure. There were so many things about that aircraft that was just wrong. And then the way it was launched, it was just a bunch of government ministers deciding this was the right thing to do and overruling any commercial concerns whatsoever. It was, the opposite of a market economy. And Airbus has, to its great credit, reformed itself since, become a far more commercially savvy organization. But back then, it had just as much in common with, some Soviet-era workplace than than what has become.
We've talked about supersonic biz jets and eVTOL products that are probably overhyped, in your opinion at least. What's one technology that's underhyped? What's something that's actually going to work that more people should be talking about?
I'll get back to gearboxes. I really like gearboxes. It's only past few years that a geared turbofan has entered service. Again, that prop fan that CFM is proposing is also geared. I'd love to see a return to turboprops. There was a wonderful book David Edgerton wrote, a historian in Britain, called The Shock of the Old. And it argued that it was the rediscovery and refinement of older technologies that was just as important to the future as exciting and flamboyant new ones. And gearboxes, turboprops, and everything like that are an older technology, but I think they need to be rediscovered in this time where we're so concerned about emissions and fuel burn. They're hugely relevant.
You participate in the selection of the Collier Trophy, perhaps aviation's most prestigious award. You have a favorite winner or a memorable story among the companies and pilots on that list?
Oh boy, there were some great ones that I've had the honor and pleasure of seeing over the years and hearing it. To be honest, there was Oh boy, it was University of Maryland, the Gamera program, which was this hard bicycle powered vertical lift thing. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And of course, it didn't win because it hardly changed the world. But just in terms of sheer enthusiasm and whatever else of everyone involved, you couldn't help but think, oh my God, these people really made it in a lot of ways. Going back to the Wright brothers, it's the heart and spirit of aviation, right?
Will Boeing launch a new midsize airplane? It's been 18 years since we saw a clean sheet design.
I think it might take new management. I think they need to. I think they must do it. The alternative is a 30% market share. Will they do it? The way I answer this question is it's not in our forecast, but please, please, please prove me wrong.
How about China? Will they get a domestic airline business that challenges the Boeing and Airbus duopoly?
I'll give you 50-50 on that. There will be a domestic airliner, but it's not going to challenge anybody. It looks like China is preparing for a world where it's decoupled from the West, and it's one of the great tragedies of our time that China is not integrating with the world, is de-integrating and wants to replicate the old Soviet experience of state-owned industries just for local requirements. So they'll have a jetliner, and it will go absolutely nowhere outside of China.
You live in Washington, D.C., a place known probably to most people as either a news headline or maybe a school field trip location. So as a resident, what's a myth about Washington that you'd like to bust?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it, right? I mean, it's a government. The myth is that it's a government town rather than a great, great city with terrific neighborhoods, some really great restaurants, and really terrific people who don't work in government. That's exactly it. I think we're a terrific city, like a lot of other terrific cities. Once you take out the government part, which has its pluses and minuses, but beyond that, we're just a great town on our own.
Our last question is always the same on pilot's discretion. You have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Wow, that's a great one. Oh boy, do I get a return trip? I guess if you don't mind me.
I'll give you a round trip, just this once.
Oh, I deeply appreciate that. I'll always regard the 777 as the great enabler of international flight. So I took my honeymoon in Bali. Let's make that it.
Richard, thanks for being on the podcast.
It's really a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and links to additional information, visit sporties.com/podcast. And if you have comments or guest ideas, email us at podcast@sporties.com. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.